Hi, good afternoon. Great to see this full room. Amazing. My name is Joanne Stefan. I'm a principal with Deloitte Consulting, and I'm here to talk about covering. And I have my two colleagues with me, Dr. Julian Sanders and Devin Dickow. And so we are going. So yeah, there they are. So Dr. Julian Sanders. So part of the reason I'm here is because I'm the executive director of our DEI Institute, and I'm one of the lead authors on this paper that we're going to talk to you about today, which is covering or uncovering. Okay. So our objectives for today are to reflect on how you identify or how we identify and what identities make us up. We all are made up of multiple identities. We'll talk about that. Oh, we're at the activity already. So you should have, you should have a piece of paper with that either you got handed or was on the chair. Who doesn't have the paper? Raise your hand. Oh, a lot of people don't have the paper. You handed them out already? Okay. Can one of you help him? Still have a few folks up front here. No? Okay. Still have a few on this side, on the other side, Matt?
They can use the screen also.
They could also use the screen. Thank you, Devin, for helping me. So this is the activity we're going to do while you're waiting for the paper. Are we out of paper? We're out of paper. Okay, I apologize. So you're going to use the screen. You're going to reflect on your identities, which ones you have, and circle them, the ones that are on your sheet. And we want you to spend maybe 1 minute sharing with the person next to you, but we're not up to that yet. So these are our list of identities. So if you see that list, take a minute to circle all the identities that you identify with. Fifteen more seconds. Okay, look to the person to your left and share the top 3 identities that you use. What's wrong?
If everyone goes to the left, then.
Okay, I get it now.
Left or right. You're smart people.
Okay, half of you do that. I'm doing great. Okay, coming back. We're going to come back. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. If you can hear my voice, clap 3 times.
Always works.
Everybody on mute? Yeah, okay. Perfect. You guys did great. Oh my God, so much better than Houston. Okay, So what you'll notice is there are a lot of identities here. So usually when I introduce myself in these sorts of events, I say my name is Joanne Stefan. I'm a Black, queer, cisgendered woman. I am a child of immigrants. I went to state school, and I am a New Yorker. Those are some of my identities. And what we're going to talk about today is identity. And so how many of you had more than 10? Okay, more than 15? More than 20? More than 25? Okay. We are intersectional, just by being human. And what that also means is that we're not one thing, right? We're a bunch of different things, and any situation that might speak to one identity may not speak to the other, or a combination. What I love, and I was just speaking to some folks in the hallways, we were thinking about doing something for the Black queer women, at our firm, and so that's a few of those identities, and that there's a little special place for that, so that's interesting. What we are talking about is covering, though. So I did want to bring up a quote. Kenji Yoshino, who's professor at NYU Law School, also Meltzer Center of DEI. Did I get that right? Okay. It says it right there. So the quote is, when people have to work their identities instead of working their jobs, that can be a huge tax on them and on the organization, because the organization is not likely going to get the best from them. We had a study about 10 years ago where we talked about covering, and we talked about the tax on the individual. If I'm spending energy covering who I am and aspects of myself, then I'm not spending that energy thinking, being creative, going into my work. I'm spending that covering up who I am. For me, the first time I came out at work was in 2018. I was in a session with a couple of fellow leaders. One of them was actually my boss. And the prompt was to say something about yourself that no one could tell by looking at you. And I got very anxious, because I had to tell the truth. And I said, I'm bisexual. But why am I coming out to you? You should come out to me. I don't know what you are. Are you straight? Are you bisexual? What are you? This was an unsuspecting group of brand new managers. They were just there to learn how to manage people, and manage, financials or something. And so I opened that up. I was with two leaders, Michael and Nathan, who knew me, and they're like, oh, we didn't know that about you. I'm like, I know. And so that was the first time I came out at work. I'd been coming out, like most of us, my entire life. But I was able to cover that for a long time because I was married to a man, and no one ever asked me about my sexuality. They just assumed, and I didn't offer that information. But I did start coming out then, and in 2020, I no longer had that husband, but I did have a girlfriend, and so I decided to come out on Instagram. Which, as we know, is how it's official. And so I was expecting, something, I don't know, somebody to be angry or upset or challenge me or ask me questions. It was all love. And I was ready for, nothing. Everybody was like, this is great. My sister said, obviously. And so I felt like I was good. And I've been doing this work at Deloitte with my colleagues and speaking in front of people and talking about being a visible leader. But I had never really come out very publicly. And so in 2022, on LinkedIn, I came out officially. So now every person that I've ever worked with, every client, every colleague, both my ex-husbands, who already knew, by the way, I said, I came out on Instagram, but I didn't come out here, because when you come out here, then everybody really knows. And I used that opportunity to, educate people and help people feel okay about being who they are. But I got away with covering for as long as I did because of how I presented myself. And I decided I no longer wanted to cover, and when I stopped covering, it changed my life. It made such a difference for me and so much of a difference for the people around me. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. The objectives are to educate you what is covering and how does it show up. explore some things around how it manifests itself, and we'll share some of our research, and then we will enact. We'll talk a little bit about what organizations can do about covering and what they need to know. So I'm going to turn it over to Devin to talk about covering.
Thank you, Joanne. And hi, everyone. If you're standing in the back, by the way, there are open seats if you'd like to sit down. Feel free to maybe raise your hand if you have an open seat next to you. Lots of open seats, as you can see. Well, hi, everyone. Devin DeCaw. I am one of our DEI consulting practice leaders at Deloitte. A few traits about me. I am a white cisgender man. I identify as gay or queer. I am a husband. I am a parent via surrogacy. Miss my 2.5-year-olds right now. They're in California, where I live. And I had to cover in my very first job. I went to UCLA for undergrad. My first job was for a nonprofit in sub-Saharan Africa. And in Tanzania, literally society forces folks to cover this aspect of who they are. So I went to work, showed up halfway around the world. Folks around me knew that I was gay or queer, and I didn't talk about it for my entire time there. And that really impacted my ability to do my best work. So this topic is extremely close to home for me in terms of my lived experience as well. What is covering? Our CEO, Dan Helvridge, spoiled it a little bit earlier today, but to emphasize, Deloitte talks about covering as to tone down a disfavored identity to fit into the mainstream. In 1986, sociologist Irving Goffman coined the term covering, so it's been around for a while now, and he used it to describe how even individuals with a known stigmatized identity exert great effort to keep that stigma from looming large. So it was really rooted in the concept of stigma. And the example that he talked about was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, as you may know, was a wheelchair user, and he would almost always ask to be seated ahead of when his cabinet walked into the room. Not because he didn't want people to know that he was a wheelchair user, they knew, but because he didn't want that to be the first impression of him when they walked into a room. That is what covering is. It is not passing, they didn't know that he was a wheelchair user. Covering, it was downplaying because he perceived this identity as something that would lead to stigma. Sociologist Kenji Yoshino, who you saw on the previous slide, brought this concept of covering to life in a book that he published a little over 10 years ago. And he developed a framework around 4 axes of covering that we're going to talk about today. And then about 10 years ago, in 2013, Deloitte conducted a research study to explore how covering shows up in the workplace. And this was the first time that the conversation around covering became a commonplace concept along these 4 axes specifically. Deloitte and Dr. Yoshino fielded a survey with over 3,000 participants, and we found some pretty compelling statistics, some of which we're going to reference today, in large part because, again, Dan spoiled this a little bit earlier today in plenary, but not much has changed. It's quite sobering that in the last 10 years, not much has changed. So the data you're going to see today is from a yet-to-be-released study. Very exciting. You're all getting a preview of our new covering research that we're publishing very soon. There will be a QR code to sign up at the end of the presentation to find out more. But we would love your reactions as we talk about this because you're one of the first groups to get to hear some of the latest stats. Okay. So why do we cover? Our respondents from this year's research, so this year's study that we just did in the last few months, told us they cover for a multitude of reasons. So that others don't think less of me, to avoid the judgment of others, to avoid negative stereotypes, for the convenience or comfort of others, to be seen as competent and or valuable, to advance in my organization, to keep my job, to feel like I belong, for my physical safety, because others cover, to avoid punishment or retaliation, to protect my mental health. What do a lot of these reasons have in common? Anyone have a thought? Observation? Fear. Yeah. What else? Value of self. Yeah, and notice how many of these reasons say others. in relation to others. We're so focused on how others see us, what others think of us, others' actions. And fear, that breeds fear. So we'd like to introduce to you to use for the rest of our discussion today the 4 axes of covering: appearance-based, affiliation-based, advocacy-based, association-based. So I'll quickly run through them, and then we're going to get you all engaged a little bit in some conversation so we can start to think about applying these to maybe some of your own experiences or what you've observed in others. So the first is appearance-based. Appearance-based covering concerns how individuals alter their self-presentation, including grooming, attire, and mannerisms, to blend into the mainstream. An example from this most recent study, this is a direct quote from a respondent: "I try to wear clothes that are overtly matched with that of my gender so as to avoid getting misgendered as much." Appearance-based covering. The second is affiliation-based. Affiliation-based covering concerns how individuals avoid behaviors widely associated with their identity, often to negate stereotypes about that identity. "I edit the way I talk and act around my coworkers to make myself appear, quote, less gay." Third is advocacy-based. Advocacy-based covering concerns how much individuals stick up for their own group. So advocate for, or defend, stick up for their own group. I wouldn't discuss gender-based bias, even though as a woman, I think it's an extremely important issue affecting both men and women. And the fourth is association-based. Association-based covering concerns how individuals avoid contact with other group members. I refrain from bringing my same-sex partner to work events to avoid seeming too gay. Our latest research also revealed another theme: covering by proxy. Individuals avoid bringing up their connections to loved ones with stigmatized identities. So it's some of these same types of covering, but by proxy with someone else that's close to us. So, with these 4 axes in mind, we would love to practice a little bit with all of you, and we're going to be running some mics. And we have 4 fictional personas based on our research, and I love participation from the group. We're going to talk about each of the 4 people, and then you're going to tell us what type of covering or any reflections on that person's experience. Okay, we can go in any order. These are the 4. The 4 types of covering are across the middle of the slide. They are not in any particular order, but can I get a volunteer, please, to choose one of our folks and read their story aloud? Don't all jump at once. Hand here. Wonderful, thank you. Can we get a mic over here, please?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
So I'm going to go with Beckham, a non-binary individual who feels they must exclusively wear men's clothes due to working in a male-dominated workplace. The pressure to assimilate hinders Beckham's creativity and ability to express their authentic self. Appearance-based.
Appearance-based. Others agree by show of applause? Applause, hands, yes, thumbs up. Okay. Thank you. 3 more. Oh, we have another hand right down here. Thank you.
Okay, so Sanj, a lesbian woman who does not engage in conversations about sexual orientation or have any pictures of her girlfriend in her office. She works to hide her lesbian identity because she worries that her colleagues will stop including her in conversations. Association-based?
Sorry?
Association-based?
Affiliation-based.
Affiliation-based.
Association-based, you said.
It could be association-based.
Or another answer.
We're going to go with affiliation-based, but thank you. Thank you so much. And you gave me a great opportunity to emphasize that this is a framework meant to help us label, because naming things helps us to identify behaviors, and covering is about the covering behavior that we exhibit in the workplace. So it doesn't really matter. This matters because it gives us a language, but it doesn't really matter which type it is per se. So thank you so much for playing along One hand down here for a third one.
Yeah, you got Becca coming.
Thank you.
I'll do Leah. A married transgender woman who does not bring her wife to work events. When asked about the wife's attendance, Leah deflects the answer and answers that she's busy. Leah fears looking too gay. Association-based?
Very good. Thank you. Association-based for Leah. And one more, and perhaps by process of elimination, this one is a little easier, but we have one more hand over here.
Jacob is a bisexual man who does not feel comfortable sharing his sexual orientation. He's overheard others make jokes, dismissing bisexuality as a fad. He worries that being open about his bisexuality, will result in his colleagues taking him less seriously or dismissing him. That would be the last one, which is advocacy-based.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you again so much for playing along. With these 4 axes of covering in mind, we're going to dig into the data. I'm going to pass it to Julian to do that. But before I do that, actually just want to pulse the room. Now that you've had a little bit of time to think about your own identities, to learn about the different types of covering, if you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious, just by show of hands, who has covered at work? By show of hands. Look around. Okay, well, I hope this means we will not be surprised by some of the sobering data that Julian is about to share.
Thank you. Thank you, Devin. Hello, Out and Equal. Feels good to be on the stage. So, as Joanne and Devin said, it's been 10 years, right? We reached back out to our friends at NYU at the Metzler Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and we wanted to see how has covering behavior changed and if people were covering in different ways. And as Joanne said, and as Devin said, and even our CEO earlier said, the results have shown that covering has not changed drastically. So this time around, we surveyed 1,269 individuals in the US across 5 industries at organizations or employers that had at least 500 employees. And what we found was 60% of our respondents said that they are still engaging in covering behavior. Now, I want to be bold and say, does anybody possibly know what that number was in 2013? We're all, 61. I thought that came up earlier. So as you can see, a 1% difference over 10 years. So now let's look at what covering will actually show up, how it showed up in our respondent pool when we look at gender and sexual orientation. Now, before I jump into the data, I will say I work with an amazing team of market researchers. I serve as our market research lead on our team, and I identify as a Black, and I'll say it because I'm Out and Equal, a Black, proud gay man. Thank you. Thank you. Who is still not used to being called a doctor, so let's not hold these statistics to my heart or my head.
J.
Thank you, but you can call me Dr. J. So, for the purposes of our research, I do want to denote that we did have to disaggregate our data. We advocate proudly that we are disaggregating our data. So you will notice that even when we look at the acronym that we used, we did use LGBTQ+ versus LGBTQIA+ because we actually did not have any respondents who identified as intersex in our respondent pool. And we wanted to be sure that we were accurately reflecting our respondents holistically. So as you see, 69% of our LGBTQ+ respondents are actually covered, or actually engaging in covering. You will notice when you look at gender that cisgender women and our non-binary and or transgender respondents actually engaged in covering at a higher rate than men. And when you look at sexual orientation, you will notice that we actually separated our bisexual respondents from our LG+ respondents. And when we say LG+, we mean our lesbian, gay, asexual, demisexual, pansexual, and queer respondents, and or not listed. And you will see that those respondents covered at much higher rates than any other group. And so, before we move on, I would just want to say that we also we'll look at our bisexual respondents. We'll look at all of these again a little bit further when we look at race, gender, sexual orientation on our next slide. So we'll work this slide a little differently. We'll start by looking at race and gender, and you'll notice right off the bat that our white men respondents covered at 54% compared to our white women. Then when you look down one row, you'll notice that our black men cover at 43% and black women covered at 80%. When looking at this data, does anyone notice a very interesting trend? You can raise your hand, but you don't have to say the answer if you think you notice an interesting trend. If you notice that white men actually cover in this study at a higher rate than black men, you get a gold star today. But also think about the fact that black women are covering at a drastically higher rate than our black men in this particular study. Now look at our Asian respondents. You will notice that Asian women actually covered at 86%. Any other trends you notice as we look at this data? If you realize that women and people of color, specifically our women of color in our study, actually covered at a drastically higher rate than our white men, think about your teams and how you could create space for your women colleagues on your teams. Now, when looking at our transgender and our non-binary respondents, you'll notice there's an asterisk. That means that we did not actually have a high number of respondents that held the identity. However, we still wanted to be inclusive of their story. And so 67% of our transgender and or non-binary respondents actually shared that they cover. Now, when looking at sexual orientation a little further, there might be a very interesting trend that you notice right away. As I stated on our last slide, our bisexual and LG+ respondents cover very highly. And if you notice, again, our respondents who are people of color covered at a drastically higher rate than our white respondents. Now let's look at that last column, the people with disabilities. As you look at the data, you will notice again, those who held a marginalized identity tended to cover at a higher rate. So as you think about your teams, your colleagues, your organizations that you represent, think about how you could possibly create space for those individuals. And for me, I'll say it. I told you I kind of came out and equal. I would say for my team, Joanne creates a lot of space for me. She made me get on this stage today. Against my will. Kidding. But for me, an example of this is I now know that I have psychological safety and also a team that really prides itself on authenticity, because there was a time, even in our organization, that I wouldn't have shared those details. And think about the psychological safety and the work your colleagues have to do to show up every day. So I'll go ahead and turn it over.
We do have one more. We should talk about the cost of covering.
Yes.
Why is it a problem?
So if we're thinking about covering a little deeper, there is a cost. Joanne, did you want this slide?
I can do it, sure. So when we talk about covering, we've talked about the individuals who cover. Really what we want to talk about is the organizations that demand covering, or the organizational demand for covering. So when people cover, 60% of general respondents, 65% of LGBTQ+ respondents say it impacts their overall well-being. Feeling like my activities are constantly being monitored at work. My sense of opportunities available to me within my organization, not as much. I feel emotionally drained. It impacts my sense of myself. I feel like I have to pretend to be someone else in order to be seen as part of the team. I feel like I have to mirror the behaviors or appearance of others to be perceived as more professional. My commitment to my organization is impacted, and my ability to perform my job to the best of my ability is impacted. So when we talk about covering and people having to cover who they are in their team, these are the costs that we're talking about, right? Does anyone have any identification with any of this? Okay, thank you. And so what we can see here is there's impact as reported by our general respondents, and then for the LGBTQ+ community, for the most part, it's even higher, an even higher cost and even higher impact. So we asked our respondents, if we were to make change, if your organization could make change, what would you want them to do? And so 88% of general respondents, 92% of LGBTQ+ respondents claim that actions taken by the organization helped reduce the demand to cover, already taken by the organizations, which demonstrates promise for the capacity of leaders to disrupt a culture of covering. Okay, we're going to talk about that. 60% of LGBTQ+ respondents say they believe the team leaders are genuinely desire authenticity, and 52% say the team leaders create a sense of psychological safety. So 92% say our organizations have done some things, only 60% say that the team leaders want the authenticity, but 52% say that there's actual psychological safety. And so this is what our respondents say would help and would make the difference for them. And they said, if we saw ourselves in the leadership, do we see ourselves in the leadership? Do we see our leaders and teammates uncovering? Are they bringing their whole selves to work? Are they talking about their families or their lives and encouraging others to do the same? Increasing open, honest communication and engaging in active allyship. And so this is what we've heard back from the respondents. We have some ideas of our own in how we help organizations and help leaders like you to make that space for others. So we talk about mitigation strategies, and we'd like to hear from you on these. Create self-awareness, create awareness for self and others. One of the things we talk about in our paper is making the space for others. So what does that mean? Does that mean that I need to spill my guts to my team? No. It does mean, though, that I have to normalize things that perhaps others may not talk about, right? So on our team, I spend an inordinate amount of time talking about Beyonce. And so, so others felt comfortable, I believe, to talk about Beyonce in the team. You can ask him. But more seriously, I've shared a lot with different teams that I've been with. I've shared different types of things with my clients. When I, as a leader, make the space for that, then other people understand that there's space for them. And so I told a story about coming out earlier. The reason I felt comfortable coming out, one of the first people to like my post on LinkedIn was Doug Bodwin. He is our chief markets and clients leader at Deloitte, and he is an out visible gay man with a family, and he talks about it, and just like anybody else would talk about their family. And the reason I felt okay about coming out at work, honestly, is because I saw his example. And him coming back and endorsing me and saying, all the way out, it was really encouraging to me as a person, as part of the firm. And so we have a lot of guidelines and helpful instructions on how to create that space. When you're creating that space, we have to remember that if it's safe for everyone, then we are making space for different types of people and different identities within that. So, there may be some identities that feel more accepted than others. We have to make sure we understand which identities are showing up at work, right? It may not be obvious to us. We may not know who they are. So as leaders, our job is to get curious and to ask questions and to be willing to make mistakes and to be willing to say the wrong thing. Trip, you'll remember we had a session a few weeks back, and we talked about being able to bring things out in the teams, and one of the issues that folks were concerned about was, well, what if I say the wrong thing? What if you say the wrong thing? That's my question to you. What if you say the wrong thing? What happens? You learn? Yes. Start again, right? We make mistakes, we're human. And so I've definitely said the wrong thing in many instances. If we as leaders can humble ourselves to actually be willing to make mistakes and ask for help and ask questions and learn, then we can make space for others. And then the third is to engage in active allyship. I put the qualifier there, active, in front of allyship. So it's not really saying, hey, I support you from the back. It's standing next to you, right? It's when I'm acting as an ally, I make sure I check in with the person that I'm working with to see what they would like me to do. Sometimes I could step in, sometimes not. Sometimes I'm, pulling somebody off to the side and calling them in instead of calling them out, right? Hey, I don't know if you realized, this is what happened. This might be the impact on the person in the room. You don't know that, there was this other person in the room or this other person is hearing it. So just as, when we share our stories, it has impact far and wide, sometimes with people that we never meet. When we don't share our stories or when we don't have space for other stories and for people to bring their whole selves, then that shuts them down. So then they know, well, there's no space for me here. I don't need to do this. These are the three general areas that we talk about in our paper. We'd love to hear from you if we could bring the lights up a little bit and your activity to hear from the audience.
Thanks, Joanne. As Joanne said, these are the general themes that we've started to come up with and that will be in our research paper on tactics. And before we open it up to all of you for your ideas, I do want to go back quickly to this data here, just to keep in mind as I pose this question to you. We didn't really land on this for a super long time, but I want this to sink in for a moment. These are the costs of covering behavior at work for everyone in all identities. They are losing their sense of self. It's compromising their well-being. It's impacting commitment to organizations, ability to perform. I mentioned my own story of working for an NGO in Tanzania. I did not do my best work, my very first job, because I was covering opportunities within the organization. And all of these stats are higher for our LGBTQ+ respondents. So the cost of covering behavior at work is performance, commitment, self, well-being. This is just simple humanity. This is humanity at work in your day-to-day. So one ask we have of all of you in this room as you're processing this data, as we're about to pose this question of what can we do about it, is this case that is clearly laid out on this slide right here. Covering is costing your employers money, ultimately. It is costing them a lot. So what can we do about it? I'm going to keep this slide up, but we shared those 3 mitigation strategies. We would love to hear from you. How do you think you could disrupt covering culture at your organizations? That is not to say the burden is on us as queer people to make things better for queer people. Absolutely not. We have a role, a responsibility, and opportunity. And in some ways, that responsibility is felt even more deeply because of the fact that we're here and we have the privilege to be part of this learning experience together. What can you do to disrupt covering at your organization or your other organizations? I see some hands. We have a hand right here and a hand right here. We'll bring the mics.
Can I bring the lights up?
Start here. Thank you.
Hey, Jonathan Siegel from AstraZeneca, HEHM. I think education of allies is really important, and as part of that education, sharing with them this type of thing, letting them know that there are people who work with them who are uncomfortable bringing them their whole authentic selves to work, and then giving them small tactics about things that can help people to open up and not have to cover. So things like a magnet on their desk or a little button or a flag, like those small things really can make a difference and signal to their LGBTQ+ colleagues that it's okay to come out and talk about what they did over the weekend in full detail.
Thank you. And what I like about that suggestion of education is, I hesitate to use this word, but it's a mathematical term. It normalizes some of these aspects of our identities. So by having something on your desk or making it part of day-to-day conversation, it becomes in the flow of work. It's not this thing on the side, but people develop comfort, and that can help to potentially mitigate covering behavior. Thank you. There's one over here as well.
Hi, my name is Mary. I'm an ally, and I tell everybody.
Thank you for being here.
I tell everybody I can about my transgender daughter, because I figure if I more open I am as somebody who had to learn very, intimately about all of this when I grew up in a very rural area. I just talk about her all the time, and I think it creates a safe space for other people to come to me. And even if I can't help everybody, at least I can help a couple people in my organization.
Thank you. Yeah, if one fewer person feels like they need to cover, that in itself makes a difference. That has a ripple effect.
Jody Travis, VMware. I'm going to piggyback off of that. As I was in company meetings last week, and we were asked to do an exercise, and I talked about my wife. And afterwards, a colleague I had never met before came up and thanked me and told me that he had gay children, and it made him feel comfortable. And he was able to share with me that he was an ally. So I think by not just making others comfortable, it's the allies see that they can come to us and thank us and ask questions on how they can be more of an ally.
Thank you.
Mm.
And I said the word privilege before in relating to this opportunity we all have to be together. And I think for those who are in positions of leadership where they don't feel as much of the heavy burden of talking about these things, it is incumbent that they use, important that they use, integral that they use their privilege to help mitigate covering. So there's a lot to be said for what all of us can do with our privilege. I do not identify as trans or non-binary, but I have an obligation to help practice allyship and create spaces that my trans and non-binary colleagues do not feel like they need to cover around me. So that's something little I can do, but I have that responsibility to use my privilege. So thank you for giving an example of that as well. Another hand over here.
Travis McMaster, pronouns they, them. Put your pronouns in your email signature, your Teams, your Zoom, on your slide decks, and put them everywhere. It means the world.
Thank you. Even the small things can perpetuate a culture. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Hi there, Rodney Bowen-Wright from Deloitte. Devin, I wonder if there is an asterisk that we put to covering, right? There are situations where people do need to cover, right? You mentioned you worked in Tanzania, and just close to Tanzania, you have Uganda, where it's absolutely fatal.
Illegal.
Yeah,
yep.
For you to, So I was wondering if that had any, there was any of that had, factored into you not being open when you were there. And I don't know if you have any general advice for people that are in those situations, right? Because this is an international forum, right? And sometimes you do have to do that because it could be life or death.
Thanks, Rodney. I'm sure Joanne has thoughts on this too. Why don't you go first? I have a thought.
Yeah, so first we want you to live, right? We have to survive. And there are many spaces where, yes, we can talk about other continents, but here in our country where it is not safe to be out, it is not safe to be visible. And so we do what we need to do to survive, and we have our own instinctual, intuitive understanding of what that might look like. That said, if you can be an ally to someone else where they may not feel comfortable and they do think that there's a threat of violence, we can help each other with that, right? We can identify and find each other to do that. But we're not, the thing is, the burden is not on the individual to uncover, right? It's helpful, and it helps that individual if they can uncover. The burden is on the organization or in the space they're in to not have that demand for covering, right? So to not have it be a fatal sentence to be who we are.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. I think that really hits on the theme of this year's research, actually, which is around creating a culture, values, behaviors, beliefs in which folks can choose, and it's a choice. And for those who were in the plenary earlier, Lily in her keynote, their keynote, said authenticity for them is when it's a choice, when someone can choose what they choose to share or show up with. And I think that's what we're trying to get to here with covering culture. An uncovering culture is one that allows folks to uncover if they so choose. It doesn't demand it.
My hand over here.
Hi, excuse me, Greg Lindemuth, he, him from Ernst & Young. I had a question for you. I think it was Dr. J earlier who said in the stats that these surveys were done at companies of 500 employees or more, which that kind of piqued my curiosity because at larger organizations, you have a lot of policies and procedures to help people who might otherwise not have a choice but to cover. So any sense as to how much, I'll use the phrase worse, these stats would be if we drilled down into smaller organizations? And also related to that, just curious as to why the survey was built that way versus looking at smaller companies as part of it.
And I'm going to say I welcome my colleagues to also jump in with me. I would be interested to see that as well. But I would also say that the one thing when we're talking about our culture, we did look at also the leadership, the actual culture of the organization. We looked at covering from the top down. You'll be surprised. Your younger or more, well, some organizations will say your more junior level colleagues are covering very highly, but so are your leaders. And so I would not be surprised if at smaller organizations, covering was still prevalent. I think that no matter what the organization is, there truly is a cultural means that we have to get at in regards to moving the demand to cover, and that really does go back to what both Devin and Joanne said in regards to creating that psychological safety so that you might see the shift in culture. I hope that answered your question, but I also will say...
I'll say that, we made a decision, right? We said we needed to cut it off at 500. One, we wanted to make sure that we got enough people to answer so that, it made sense and it had reasonable results. But frankly, the folks who are going to be reading this paper, for the most part, are at larger organizations who can do things to make a difference in reducing the demand for covering. I think that smaller organizations have different sorts of issues or ways of addressing this. The smaller an organization is, the more it is about perhaps an individual or a couple of individuals where, at organizations with 10,000 or 100,000 people, the difference is in the teams and in the departments, but the signaling can happen from the very top. So we chose to keep it at 500 or more.
Well, we've kind of transitioned into Q&A naturally, so we can do Q&A or ideas. All are fair game. We have some hands. Let's go here, here, then here, two over there. Okay, we'll start here then.
Hi there, Charles Orkbon with EY.
Hi, Charles.
Hi.
Former Deloitte right here.
I wanted to add to this conversation around covering a word that I wanted us to acknowledge is defensiveness. I found myself when I share, oh, this is how what you said impacted me, and like ouch, like having an ouch feeling or ouch reaction to maybe what a colleague has shared. So many times the response is defensiveness. Like that person had the opportunity to choose to listen or to choose to be right. And it's hard to be an inclusive leader if you're choosing to be right. Yeah. And so I think part of the covering, we see this happen when people who have those identities where they're covering more and more may not feel like they're going to be received well, or they're going to be met with this defensive reaction. So your question too, like what is our solution? I do think we need to work in our cultures of our companies on how to tone down on the defensiveness to really lean into these conversations.
Thank you for your comment. You're right. People, if we call them out and we say, look, you did this and this hurt me, they automatically put up their defenses because they don't want to be seen as homophobic or, queerphobic, and, they're good allies. So, how dare you accuse me of? And what we talk about at Deloitte is we talk about calling in. And so when it's about yourself, it's a little bit tougher, but if you see someone doing something, maybe you do it in the moment, maybe you do it later when the temperature is down a little bit, and you say, hey, I don't know if you realized, or, I'm not sure if you knew, so that we give them the benefit of the doubt, right? And we make space for them to be wrong and it's okay. I'm not saying, I now hate you, you are my mortal enemy. What I'm saying is, I want to be in a relationship with you. And so I value our relationship enough to be willing to take a chance and tell you how something you said or did impacted me. And I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt that you didn't know, right? And had you known, you wouldn't have made that choice, right? So I think it's about how we approach it. I personally don't, I hate to put people in positions of having to do that themselves because we don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes it's great and the person says, thank you so much. Sometimes, the person is defensive. Sometimes we're in a dangerous situation, we don't know. And so if we ever have an opportunity to do that for an ally, as an ally for someone else, that would be great. Or, if you're talking to your friends, you can say, here are the things, and that really bothered me. Not to send them to talk to the person, but give them some tools to use in order to talk to folks. But really, if we're calling people in, what we're saying is, you're part of us, and we want to be together, and here's how we do that in a better way.
I also, two dissonant things can be true, and this is what I mean. The original definition of covering that I mentioned from George Orwell in the 80s is around the effort we expel against the stigma or perceived stigma. And stigma lives in us as individuals, that's one truth, but it also lives in the system, within the organization, within the broader marketplace, within broader society. See what I did there?
Thank you.
Deloitte frameworks for you. And that's okay as well, to acknowledge that perhaps an individual colleague or leader that I'm working with is a product of the culture and the system in which they live, and the system needs to be disrupted. That does not excuse the individual from their role in changing behavior. And again, those two maybe dissonant things can be true. And I think it's really important to acknowledge both of those things. And when we talk about culture, we talk about that system, and we talk about the individual simultaneously.
One other thing that we didn't talk about so much, you did see that number for white cisgendered men, 54% covering, and covering for, I don't want to get in trouble, but covering for typically advantaged identities, right? Well, I can't talk about this, or I can't be myself in this way because then I'll be seen as the bad guy. And what we've been calling that is the democratization of discomfort. I mean, we didn't come up with that, that's out in the lexicon, but I've been uncomfortable in your space for a very long time. And so it's okay if you're a little bit uncomfortable. I'm okay with that. So if we're going back to our organizations to talk about how to address this, we have to prepare our leaders to be okay being uncomfortable, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because otherwise, how can we learn? We don't learn in our comfort zone, right? We learn outside of our comfort zone, in our challenge zone. And if you're going to try to play it safe and never be uncomfortable, you're never going to be able to build the team or the space that you need.
We have more hands. I saw that one back there first, and then I saw right here in the middle next.
Hello, Kyle Page, he, him at Nestle USA. Big thing that I like that we've discussed so far, there's so many other options to be doing it. Big thing is make sure it's measured. Whatever you are going to put into place, whatever you can push for to advance and make things better, what gets measured, gets mentioned, gets moved. And so many of the great questions that you asked are things that are available in employee listening. Many of us have demographics at work that we can analyze this, we can make action plans, we can bring this to leadership. So along with the great ideas, make sure there's some version of process change, make sure there's some version of measurement, make sure there's something that is very there, and that way you can actually say we've progressed, because we like to progress. I don't think anybody likes to sit there and just stay the same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question over here.
Hi, Hi, Julie Klein, Deloitte, pronouns are she, her. I wanted to go back to the data for a second because I noticed in the demographics, right, you separated bisexual from the L and the G. And I wanted to get into that a little bit. If you could speak to kind of why you made that choice. I have an inkling just from, I'm bi and I have read studies, but just curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about why you made that choice to kind of separate that demographic. Yeah.
Yes, so thank you for the question, Julie. In this particular study, we did have a higher number of respondents who identified as bisexual. And because of that, we wanted to make sure that we reflected their stories and their insights in our overall data set. Then we also had another group of individuals who identified as LG+, or I think if we go back one more slide, and you can see the end counts at the bottom under the chart. When we grouped those, or we brought the bisexual respondents out, we did that because statistically, based off of our data analysis, we did have a high enough threshold to be able to make a generalization about this sample to the general population. So that's one reason. And then also too, we strive to disaggregate the data where we can. And it, being a fellow Deloitter, you know we're all about transparency. We did want to make sure that we were telling the stories of our respondents and highlighting their experiences, and because we had such a higher count, we felt that it was best appropriate. I know we would have done the same thing if we had a respondent who identified as intersex or any other community that is, or individual identity that is represented within our community, but that was one of the primary reasons. So thank you for your question.
Wow, a lot of hands just popped up. We only have a few minutes left, by the way, so I will say we might not get to all of them. We'll go.
Hi, my name is Micaela Rianda. I work for Toyota. This was the first talk I've been able to hear about this topic, and it really resonates with masking in the neurodivergent community and the burnout that exists there, especially when you guys talked about the business loss that is associated with covering. And I was wondering if you guys knew if there was any other intersectional papers that were maybe in process or studies that had to do with that, because I also know that neurodivergent people struggle with employment as a whole.
That's a great topic. I don't know of any, but that is something that I'm looking for. I have been covering my ADHD for my entire career. And, there is a comorbidity is the word, right, of that in the LGBTQIA community. And so that is, I think that's one of the things that we might want to look at after this. But I'm personally looking for papers that speak about that specifically. Thank you. There was a hand back there. This woman is standing.
An energetic hand.
It's because I'm 5'1", that's why I'm standing. Yeah. My name is Fiona Dawson. My pronouns are she, her. I am an out bisexual, pansexual, queer woman, immigrant living with a non-apparent disability. I really love that you separated out bisexual here, but I'm also extremely curious why pansexual and queer went with lesbian and gay plus, because many of us who identify as bisexual also identify as pansexual and queer. So I'd love to see what that number would look like if the lesbian and gay, which is more of an arguably binary identity, was compared to more non-binary sexual orientations. And of course, bisexuals are the majority of the lesbian, gay and bi community. We're about 57, 58% of the community. So that just really had me wondering.
I mean, we would love to have more data on every single intersection. Really, this is more about how many people responded and how different their responses were from everyone else. But, had we had a larger sample size, I think we would have been able to pull out, each individual identity. So it was just a matter of how much we had that was different from the rest of the group.
And the options that were in the survey. We have less than a minute, so maybe last question.
Yeah,
sure. Okay, last question. Keep you all on schedule.
Hi, Lyria, JP Morgan Chase, they, them. My comment, I have a comment and a question/challenge. My comment is that for one of my sort of volunteer jobs, I run the DEI organization for my tech center. And we intentionally make sure all of our events are intersectional, looking for intersectional communities that are not often spoke of. Because when we do that, we find that there are people in the community that all of a sudden raise their hands and say, oh, that's me. So, you know, for example, during Black History Month, we make sure that there's an event about, you know, lesbian Black people or, you know, Black people on the spectrum. We do that all throughout the year. My question/challenge is on the section where you had all the comments about the reasons people mask. As someone who's not American, who was born elsewhere, I find them to be very Western-centric. Because there are people who are brought up in societies where everything is about thinking of everyone around you. So that may not be, I don't know that that would be an approach that would help people uncover who are in Asia, for example, because they can't just all of a sudden say, you know what, it is about me. Because it isn't all about them.
No, you're absolutely right. Our intention at the beginning of the study was to have it be global. And really, it was a logistical decision that we made to start in the US. But we fully expect to expand this. We want to expand it to be global. We want to expand it to measure more intersections so that we can share this data and make recommendations and share it with folks who have global roles and are in global organizations. So we do have a QR code here. I would love for all of us to get that if you haven't gotten it yet. You will be notified when the paper is published, which should be soon. Thank you so much for your interaction and your engagement.
Thank you.